you all. We did have a little waiting room music for you there, but it couldn't come through on the share. So I'm sorry about that. That's the way it goes. But I would turn your attention to as we were preparing this, I was thinking of Heinrich Goretzky's Third Symphony from 1976, the last of the three sorrowful songs. Another one about a mother lamenting losing her child to war. So maybe after our presentation, you might want to reflect with that really, really monumental piece of music from the mid-70s. Anyway, I want to welcome you. Good afternoon, and welcome to another in our ongoing series on Conversations on the Catholic Imagination. My name is Michael Murphy, and I direct the Hank Center here at Loyola Chicago. And on behalf of university leadership and on behalf of the Hank family, whose generous gift supports our wide programming and initiatives, I extend an additional layer of a hearty greeting. So grateful for the Hank family. I also want to extend a welcome from our dedicated center staff, Megan Toomey, our center manager, and Kathleen McNutt, who is our graduate student assistant. Megan and Kathleen are most instrumental in preparing and promoting our many events, and I remain grateful for their work. Today's event is called War, Peace, and the Catholic Imagination. It features National Book Award winning novelist Phil Klein, and multiple award winning poet Philip Metris. This event will include shorter readings by both Phil and Philip, interspersed with periods of discussion and reflection, and then opened up to participant comment Q&A, and more on that in a moment. Just was speaking about this, but usually in March, we in the Hank Center, we always hold an event on Pope Francis and his papacy. We did not schedule one for the first time this year, but Francis will have a seat at our table nonetheless, and it is a grace. Today is the 61st anniversary of his profession of vows with the Society of Jesus, and Saturday is the 8th anniversary of his pontificate. So congratulations, Papa Francesco, you are a blessing to us. And Pope Francis figures into our topics here today, as both Phil's and I have been emailing about Pope Francis as we have prepared for our event today. Pope Francis is no stranger to war, having had to navigate its more complex contours as Jesuit provincial in Argentina in the 1970s. Francis devotes significant space to war, human conflict, peace, imagination, and reconciliation in his recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. He concludes the document with a kind of prayer appeal for all people of goodwill. And there are a couple of excerpts from that. So Pope Francis writes, "In the name of the poor, the destitute, the marginalized, and those most in need, whom God is commanded to help as a duty required of all persons, especially the wealthy and those of means. In the name of the orphans, widows, refugees, and those exiled from their homes and their countries. In the name of all victims of wars, persecution, and injustice. In the name of the weak, those who live in fear, prisoners of war, those tortured in any part of the world without distinction. In the name of peoples who have lost their security, peace, and the possibility of living together, becoming victims of destruction, calamity, and war." He continues like this, but then concludes, "In the name of God and of everything stated thus far, we declare the adoption of a culture of dialogue as the path, mutual cooperation as the code of conduct, reciprocal understanding as the method and standard." So that's pretty, there are no uncertain terms there. And you hear echoes of other works, other prayers. One mode of dialogue with a long tradition is the arts. Fiction, poetry, film, and the other arts of the beautiful proceed not by dogma, but by drama, by showing rather than telling, by singing rather than demanding. It so happens this was also the preferred theology and pedagogy of Jesus. To tell a story or to muse beautifully on its points, or a point, or a scene, or an idea, this creates a culture of dialogue. and reciprocity, for it honors both the freedom and the capacity for learning and understanding, and for the respect of the hearer of the word, who is a free individual. It also recognizes, on the other hand, implicitly, human recalcitrance and obstinance. But we will table those aspects right now, even if they are navigated so expertly and profoundly by both Philip and Phil in their creative work. So that's the kind of introduction to this event. Just a couple of announcements, some housekeeping, and then we'll begin. Thanks for looking at the opening slide. We have two big events coming. March 23rd, the last of our four-part series on Catholic social teaching in Catholic higher education. This one's called Beyond Patriarchy, Women and Lay Leadership, featuring Catherine Punsalon-Monlimos, and a response from Kathleen Moss-Weiger. Then that's March 23rd, and then on March 25th, our Newman Lecture, which marks the kind of intellectual and personal conversion of a person. We welcome Jennifer Frey, who is calling her talk from the Rust Belt to Rome, Conversion of a Working Class Atheist. So the note on format, and on those events, please join us. Registration is always free, and we'll see you online. Just one note on format. It's a Zoomcast, not a webinar, but a meeting. So this means that while the chat is limited, we can definitely put it into a good play. So you'll direct all of your comments and questions to me, write me directly, Michael Murphy, and I'll be happy to to navigate them and organize them and collate them and get them into play as best I can. So I appreciate that. That's the best way we get your voice involved, and we want your voice involved. So please write as you go, and thanks very much. So thanks for all that patience, the patience you've shown in listening to the front matter of our event. Let me now introduce our guests, our esteemed guests, and our friends, Phil Cly and Philip Metris. Phil Cly is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. His short story collection, Redeployment, won the 2014 National Book Award for fiction and the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize for Best Debut Work in Any Genre, and was selected as one of the 10 best books of 2014 by the New York Times. His nonfiction work won the George W. Hunt S.J. Prize for Journalism, Arts and Letters in the category of cultural and historical criticism in 2018. Phil's writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, and the Brookings Institution's Brookings Essay Series, Phil currently teaches fiction at Fairfield University in Connecticut. Welcome, Phil. Good to see you again. Philip Metris was born in San Diego, California, and grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. He has written numerous books, including Shrapnel Maps, Sand Opera, and The Sound of Listening. A scholar of war literature, Phil wrote the critical study Behind the Lines, War Resistance Poetry on the American Home Front since 1941. Phil is the recipient of many awards, including fellowships from the Guggenheim and Lannan Foundations, an NEA award, and 3 Arab American Book Awards. Philip is professor of English and director of the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights program at John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio. So without further ado, please, Phil Cly, the Zoom stage is yours, and thanks again for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much. Good to see you again, even if only virtually, and thanks to everybody who's tuning in. It's a real thrill to be doing this. With Loyola and the Hank Center. Had a really profoundly moving time the last time I was with you guys, and I couldn't be more pleased to be doing this with Philip, who's a poet I've really admired for some time, and whose Shrapnel Maps is just astounding in every way. In terms of the subject matter today, before I get into the quick readings, I sort of think about the challenge I think that a war writer, particularly somebody with a Catholic sensibility, is trying to bring to bear. So, Hopkins tells us that the world is charged with the grandeur of God. But for the war writer, that can be somewhat difficult, right? Joseph Heller's Yossarian's world, right, in Catch-22, is not grand, it's trying to kill him. And Thomas Pynchon's world is a vast but horrifying interconnected web trapping human flies by the tens and hundreds of thousands, where, quote, a million bureaucrats are diligently plotting death, and some of them even know it. As modern men and women, especially of a literary sensibility, we've been disabused of the old lie about war, and we know you're not supposed to suggest lofty ideals have any place in the ugly realities of the subject. I had seen nothing sacred, Hemingway told us in A Farewell to Arms, and the things that were glorious had no glory, and the sacrifices were like the stockyards at Chicago if nothing was done with the meat except to bury it. There are many words that you could not stand to hear, and finally, only the names of places had dignity. Certain numbers were the same way in certain dates, and these, with the names of the places, were all you could say and have them mean anything. Abstract words like glory, such as glory, honor, courage, or hollow, were obscene beside the concrete names of villages, the numbers of roads, the names of rivers, or the numbers of regiments and the dates. Okay, very well, Ernie. And yet there's that word, dignity, an abstraction like the rest, but deeply felt. Perhaps we're not so cynical as we think we are. Yes, he's rejecting some abstractions, but only those that have drifted so far from reality that they paper over our real ugliness. The seemingly concrete names of villages and the numbers of roads that mean so much to his narrator are not simple matter, but gesture toward the blood and pain and sacrifice, as well as towards the respect those things are due. Here, we're edging closer to what the poet David Jones, whose experience in World War I led him to Catholicism, was getting at when he said he wanted his poetry to be incarnational. Against a false dichotomy with abstractions on one hand and concrete reality on the other, his view was the Catholic one that the human soul and the matter that it informs constitutes one substance, carnal and spiritual. Tom Slay has argued that in Jones' great World War I poem, in parentheses, Jones makes the war so physically immediate that abstractions evaporate. The terrible physicality of the war registers in our senses before lodging in the understanding. And of course, from an incarnational perspective, physicality is not mere materiality. Jones first considered converting after seeing a priest conducting mass in an outhouse near the front lines and being struck as the priest handed out the Eucharist by, quote, the oneness between the offerant and those tufts that clustered round him in the dimly lit fire, a thing I had never felt remotely as a Protestant at the office of Holy Communion. The distinctive quality of the Eucharist, of course, was that it was not mere symbol, not mere abstraction, but the thing itself. For Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, St. Paul tells us. And that proclamation is not an event in the past, but a present reality made active through the celebration of the Mass. As Jones would later put it in a description of the Eucharist, nothing could be less representational or further from realism or more near reality than what is intended and posited. War, of course, is a province of force that makes people things. And modern war, in which killing can be done from exceptional distance with almost no cost or notice by the population waving it, is the province of abstract systems causing very real damage to human flesh. The question for the war writer, I think, is to capture both those systems which obliterate the human, seek to reduce it to mere materiality, and to call witness to the grandeur of God present in the concrete physical world. That's why I try to follow in the shoes of a Catholic writer like Jones, who still believes in the meaning of things, that there's a space for sacredness amidst the senseless slaughter because of the presence of human beings and a natural landscape charged with real grandeur. In a way, I think the slaughter in works with this sensibility is more devastating than in works that are more straightforwardly cynical. In the wake of true horror, cynicism is an escape and nihilism is comforting, but it doesn't work in the end because it doesn't accurately represent the world. Things of real meaning and sacredness are being destroyed. And so I'm going to give you a little bit from the beginning of my book, which tries to capture a little bit of what is lost when violence is done. And this is from the perspective of one of the main characters, Adele. It's just the beginning of the book. My town sat on top of a small hill by the side of a river whose banks held only sand. At noon, you had to walk quickly so as not to burn your feet. But when it rained, the river would overflow and turn our central street to mud. All us children would go out slipping and pushing each other, playing in the mud before the sun baked it hard and the wind carried it away as dust. To talk about this part of my life is to talk about another person, like a person in a story, a boy with a father and mother and 3 sisters, one pretty, one smart, and one mean. A grandfather who drank too much and beat everyone at dominoes, a teacher who thought the boy had talent, a priest who thought he was wicked, friends and classmates and enemies and girls he watched with increasing wonder, like Jimena, who had thick curly hair and fair skin and who got pregnant with the baby of one of the local guerrilleros. Most people think that a person is whatever you see before you walking around in bone and meat and blood, but that is an idiocy. Bone and meat and blood just exists, but to exist is not to live. And bone and meat and blood alone is not a person. A person is what happens when there is a family and a town, a place where you are known, where every person who knows you holds a small invisible mirror. And in each mirror, held by friends and family and enemies, is a different reflection. In one mirror, the sweet fat boy I was to my mother. In another, the little imp I was to my father. In another, the irritating brat I was to Gustavo. A person is what happens when you gather all these reflections around a body. So what happens when one by one, the people holding those mirrors are taken from me? It's simple. The person dies. And the bone and meat and blood goes on, walking the earth as if the person still existed, when God and the angels know he doesn't. So that is Abel. And I'm going to give you something from the very end of the book. And this is, there's a character, Juan Pablo, who ends up working in Yemen as a mercenary. And he's been trained in a style of targeting, right? Targeting human beings that he has learned from the Americans, right? As an army officer in Colombia. Over the past 2 decades, America has developed a very sophisticated system for finding and eliminating enemies, right? And the system involves a variety of different parts, and it has some roots in Colombia. It's one of the reasons that that I picked Colombia as a subject of the novel. But to give you an example, in 2004, U.S. Special Operations Command in Iraq is conducting about 12 killer capture missions a month. By 2006, we're in the hundreds, right, in terms of missions that are done. Sometimes there are missions that, one team goes out early in the evening and the intelligence that they gather is being used to send another team out that same night. And the difference in terms of what happened in 2004 and 2006 is not that, say, the Navy SEALs, the Army Rangers, went to the gym and got more buff and, better at doing their job. It's the system which is tying together technologies, direct action units like Navy SEALs or Army Rangers, and all the kind of various different agencies that need to be involved in analyzing and exploiting intelligence and then acting on it. That system became very, very tight, right? And refined. And that system, which is extremely deadly, has been applied around the world and just been taught other people how to do it. And they're doing it in Yemen. And so this is a moment in the book where they have they had killed someone, and then they were observing a funeral to see who showed up and who they might target again. And they're about to sort of hit them. And Juan Pablo is in the United Arab Emirates, but he's helping direct this stuff that's going on in Yemen. Juan Pablo closed his eyes, took in the hum of the operations center. He wondered if the men who were about to die were capable of appreciating everything that went into their deaths. An American mercenary was aiming a laser at the instruction of an American pilot operating a Chinese drone. They were communicating over an encrypted frequency routed through a Canadian aircraft mounted with Swedish surveillance technology, bounced from repeater hub to the main air-ground tower at their airbase in the empty quarter. The drone pilot, in turn, was communicating with an Emirati fighter pilot in an American aircraft armed with a laser-guided bomb capable of being launched from 9 miles away and 40,000 feet up and still detonating within 10 feet of its target. He heard someone clear the pilot's hot. Was it Jeffy? It didn't matter. He knew, as everyone in the operations center knew, that in another country, miles and miles away from the men of another religion and another way of life, breathed their last. They knew, and the ground team knew, and the pilots knew, but no one else. Then, thousands of feet above the target building, the pilot did nothing more complicated than push a little button. A series of small charges on a rack mounted underneath his plane ignited, blowing away the hooks holding his bomb in place. It wobbled out into the air, awkward, ungainly, a baby bird the size of a car, detached from its parent and plummeting through space, or almost detached. A thin wire trailed behind it, still connected to the jet, unspooling and unspooling and unspooling until there was no more wire left, and it tore itself from its mother. Only then did it open its eyes. A sensor on the nose locked onto the sparkling building 4 fins at its tail extended outward. It adjusted the angle of its fins, added lift, stability, no longer plummeting. It flew. So many things had to happen for these men to arrive at their deaths. Start with the invention of the internal combustion engine, follow with the development of Europe and the Americas and the rest of the world, creating a ravenous appetite for oil, which created oil rigs and refineries and massive wealth for desert princes. Then global supply chains, trade agreements, secure shipping routes, and the law of the sea. Negotiated arms sales too. Add in the vast edifice of Western science, computing, and radio technology, the space race and the microchip, Silicon Valley and the military-industrial complex, and other subtler developments. American pioneered methods of high-value targeting, the post-9/11 explosion of private military contractors. It took all of the massively complex, interconnected modern world to bring these men to their deaths. It was a shame they were incapable of appreciating it. There we go.
Thanks, Phil. That's a great set of readings to get us thinking, and I appreciate your setup as well. So, Philip Metris, what are you hearing in those texts? Anything moving in you to respond to Phil?
Phil, thank you so much for that reading. And one of the things I was thinking about was a debate that actually happened in the poetry world during the Vietnam War, which was between, not really a debate, but an argument among friends that ruined a friendship. It was between Robert Duncan and Denise Levertov, who would end up converting to Catholicism. Duncan was angry with Levertov because her poems were increasingly prophetic and anti-war. And what Duncan said was, Denise, you don't understand that our job as writers, as poets, is not to oppose evil, but to imagine it. And one of the interesting things I think about what I've read so far of this book and of the question of the Catholic imagination around this is that there's a tension between those two, longings, right? And so I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think there's in very good writing, I think there's what Iris Murdoch talked about as like a small c conservative element, which is you're trying to describe the world, right? You're trying to show your audience what it is that you're seeing, and is why Flannery O'Connor, said it wasn't the writer's mind necessarily that was their great gift; it was their eye, right? And so that's restricting in some way because the temptation, especially when you're dealing with something that you find morally morally repulsive or morally troublesome, or where you have a strong political conviction, right? Is that the temptation is to reduce the complexity of reality in order to guide the reader toward your particular convictions, right? Rather than exploring the complexity of political emotions, right? Rather than getting them to fully enter the world in a rich way, which would then sort of call forth who knows, what from the reader. I mean, one of the kind of funny things about really good literature is oftentimes it gets read by people of radically different politics and ideas and sensibilities than what the authors ever would have intended, and yet can become powerfully useful tools for people of exactly opposite ideological persuasions, because whatever the failings or blind spots or particular idiosyncrasies of Ezra Pound or Celine, right? In that small c conservative way, they were capturing a piece of reality in a very important way. But there's also, I think, a kind of progressive or revolutionary aspect of art, right? Which is that in the process of art, you're not just trying to do mimesis. You're not just trying to reproduce reality. You're crafting a new way of seeing. When I read Frank Bidart, I'm encountering the world in a way that I never have before, right? I mean, that's why, and in a very different way when you're reading Gerard Manley Hopkins, right? And the work itself is a thing in the world, and it can sort of open you to new possibilities and new connections, and so I think that tension has always been there, but it's a way of seeing that kind of gets across so powerfully to me, less so than particular sort of, especially sort of narrow political convictions, right? I think really good art calls forth a political response from us, and should engage with politics, because politics is a part of our life. It's how humans decide how to live together, right? How could that not be an apt subject for fiction? And yet the ways that it does so are chaotic. And if they're not chaotic, I think oftentimes it's because the writer is not doing their job.
Let me jump in there, Phil. I think you're onto something when you amplify the importance of seeing, and citing O'Connor is perfect, who famously said, "Nothing is profane for those who know how to see." And so, and then the example, Metris of Levertov, she commits two crimes as far as Duncan is concerned. The first is to dally around in politics, and the second is to dally around in religion, which she does next. She goes from those. She has kind of her reversion, if that's the right term for it, to a theological stance, and conversion is an aesthetic one primarily, but it comes from seeing and making. So that's quite wonderful. At the risk of Philip, please jump in too, but I want to hit your bookends, Phil Cly, and the David Jones and his seeing of a priest doing what a priest does in the chaos of war, and being moved by it. Reminds me of someone who's in the news these days, Father Emile Capone. Have you been following that story at all? He's now a servant of God. Maybe Philip Metris, have you been following that at all? No. Okay. Well, I'm not. I won't spend too much time, but this is a priest who got the Medal of Honor from Barack Obama, which is an award for altruism, basically. But he served in World War II and Korea, and saved hundreds of lives, and he's a hero. So something to think about there, and to dwell on. But Philip Metris, did you have any other insights? What else moved in you in your hearing of Phil's reading?
Well, the last sentence that he read was so powerful, because I think one of the things that that novels do well, and I hope that maybe some of my poems are trying to do, is to demonstrate the way in which human beings are caught in systems that they have not constructed yet, inside of which they are either complicit or victims, and sometimes both, right? And that sentence to me was such a powerful rendering. It's too bad that this person couldn't see the system for the, and that goes back to that question of the imagination. I mean, one of the things that strikes me so forcefully is the ingenuity of military means, and that the imagination is not an inherently good thing, because we can see how we've used imagination in all sorts of incredibly perverse ways as well. And so I thought that your work really balanced from the particular to that systemic level kind of analysis. I wonder, and I'm really interested actually in why you chose Colombia more, and your process of research and sort of thinking about those layers of the sacred individual, the dignity of each person, alongside the sort of the profanity of some of the systems in which we find ourselves.
Right. Yeah. A variety of reasons. I mean, there's so much cross-pollination between Colombia and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? So that sort of method of targeting that I talked about, sort of an early version of it was developed in the hunt against Pablo Escobar. Then it gets used in the Balkans, and then from 2004 to 2006, it becomes extremely sophisticated. We build up we build it into an industrial scale system that we're using all over the world. And there's a character in the book who's talking about it. He says, when most people think of a drone strike, right, they think it's kind of creepy, this kind of cold, mechanical, soulless thing killing somebody from miles away. When they think of, a team of Navy SEALs going in and doing a raid, they think of, it's cool, right, and traditionally heroic. But from the perspective of the targeting system, that's just the flathead and the Phillips head screwdriver at the end, right? And that system we have helped other countries with. And starting in the mid 2000s, we helped the Colombians with it, right? We started giving them smart bombs. We started helping them with targeting, and we started killing high-ranking members of these two different main guerrilla groups, right? And so at the same time, you have special forces units. So if you look at a unit like 7th Group, right, which is the U.S. military special forces unit that was designed to focus on Latin America, right? Spanish speaking, they used to call it the Puerto Rican Mafia. And then it diversified. But they have done deployment after deployment after deployment to Afghanistan. The two last American soldiers to die in Afghanistan were from 7th Group, and one of them had deployed 10 times in as many years, right? And so, there were units that were going time and time again to Afghanistan, but then also going to Colombia and working with the Colombian military. And so it just seemed like this very interesting way to look at the ways in which, there's a kind of, the beginning begins with a kind of organic community, right? He's talking about the ways that a person is a reflection of this sort of community that he's grown up with, right? And that is this organic thing that develops out of the bonds between people. But whereas the sort of systems of warfare also kind of proliferate and cross-pollinate in a way that seems not organic, right? But more like a kind of dead mechanical reproduction. And then sort of impacts with those sort of local organic things. And, I wanted to have, in terms of the way the book is structured, there's Abel, who you sort of see is kind of closest to the ground of this one region that's going to be profoundly affected by these changes happening at higher levels. There's a Colombian character who, is in the Colombian military, who, is sort of looking at the Colombian military's interests in this region. There's an American character who's in the special forces, and he, is going to kind of like looking at it from another degree of distance. And then there's a journalist who ultimately is going to try and sort of figure out how all these pieces fit together. And so they're sort of at different levels of distance, and each of them have kind of problems with the institutions that they're a part of. And so they're kind of involved in institutional fights about, what the purpose of special forces is and whether it's lost its way as it's been doing all of these extremely violent missions in Afghanistan, and so on. And then to see the way these kind of institutional structures maneuver these people together in the final third of the novel is kind of basically the idea of it.
I think it's a masterly structure that you've imagined and you've sustained, Phil. And on the points of, and you're really, you give no truck to simple answers. You capture the complexities of, wow, I mean, there's so much, it's so global, but there's always like these players. In Colombia, there's the narco-terrorists, there's FARC, there's guerrillas, there's, one week you're on this side, the next week you're on that side. And the people always who lose are the people. And so people like Alma and people like Abel. Abel is, he has his humanity stolen from him. And I think that your meditation on what a person is really a tour de force. That's a beautiful part of the book, and there's so many beautiful parts. Sarah's character at the end there, a student, she observes, left and right long ago collapsed into each other. This is what capital does. So, and I think there's this character in this book is this kind of neoliberalism that is boiling and moving everything. On the one hand, our politics are riven by neoliberalism. On the one hand, we have the humiliated on the one hand, and the hubristic on the other. And there's just something nasty going on there. But then Sarah says, "I'm done with human rights." And her friend says, "Are you going to finish the class?" "Oh yeah, I'll finish the class, on Zoom. But I'm done. I'm just like, oh my God." So any thought on that, Phil?
So so she's a kind of radical student who. So one of the characters so Juan Pablo's daughter ends up getting involved in human rights work in Abel's region, right? And Juan Pablo is very skeptical about this, and I mean, part of that is I'm a parent. My wife and I have had 3 kids while I was working on this book, putting it out. And I was definitely thinking about fatherhood, and Juan Pablo is kind of trying to like shape and control his daughter and the ideas that she's going to have in the world, and she's not really taking the lessons in the way that he hoped. And they get involved in working with this human rights organization, but it becomes a sort of messy, murky thing as they're in this small town where there's a kind of power struggle going on. And this narcissistic, dying, like former paramilitary has kind of moved in and is trying to kind of expand operations, right? Using their town as a base of operations. And the person running the sort of local organization has made the sort of a kind of delicate peace with him in order to continue the work that she's doing. And so the radical student who's there, Sarah, sort of is done with human rights work, is done with all this. She wants the kind of, I think almost like the simplicity of radicalism is like, this whole thing is corrupt, right? Society is riven with compromises, with moral evil, and so to hell with it all. And of course, the way that human rights discourse happened in Colombia around that time was complicated because there was a peace deal going on, and human rights discourse was used against the peace treaty with the FARC, right? Because the FARC had committed very serious human rights abuses. And I think there's a way in which sometimes you think that simply telling the stories of the oppressed, right, has a sort of political valence, but it doesn't, right, necessarily. The stories of the oppressed can have a variety of political valences, right? Hawks were very into stories of oppression from Iraq prior to the Iraq War, right, for obvious reasons. And so during the campaign, in the lead up to this vote over whether it was going to be a historic peace treaty with the FARC or not, human rights were employed against the treaty. There are other ways in which it just became a complicated, morally fraught enterprise to try and practically work in the real world, given the power structure of various different regions, right? And where is the space for pragmatism, and where is the space for following your ideals? And for all the characters in the novel, there's they have these kind of ideals that are guiding them forward. This is sort of pragmatics. There's their careers often that get involved, and the Sarah character ultimately has taken steps that resulted in somebody's death. And at the end, she sort of repudiates everything, but is also not so interested in looking at the wreckage left behind by what she's done.
Yeah, that's great. Phil Metris, anything to add there?
I'm going to talk for just a moment about the Northern Ireland peace deal, and precisely the tension between creating a political solution or political process. The Good Friday Accord was in direct conflict with the rights and needs of victims, and this is one of the most painful things about any peace process, is that there are many people whose lives are never restored, for whom justice is never served, and they become sort of sacrifices to a larger, the hope for a larger peace, where guns are not, going to solve everything. So.
Right. Well, one of the people I was thinking about, because in the book, there's this tension between sort of society moving forward, reconciliation, peace, and then, justice is this other thing, right? And there's a character who explicitly says, that she's interested in mercy, and mercy is always an injustice, right? Because if somebody deserves forgiveness, if they deserve reconciliation, then giving it to them isn't mercy; it's just justice. And so there's Jean-Marie was a survivor of Auschwitz. He was tortured by the Gestapo, then sent to Auschwitz, and survived. And he has this very powerful set of reflections on that experience. And one of them is called Resentment, where he begins this essay talking about how sometimes, writing in the 1960s, I'll go through a thriving land, right? Where statistics will tell you the average man and woman is doing quite well, and the resentment that he feels. And of course, the resentment that he feels is because he's going through West Germany. And he wants, and he writes the essay to justify his feeling of resentment, which, ethicists and psychologists alike have condemned. He knows that holding on to his resentments, he says, it nails every one of us on the cross of his ruined past. But because there'd been no justice, he wants time to stop until, he wants there to be no reconciliation until the entire nation wanted what had happened to have not happened as much as he wanted it to have not happened, right? And he says, what happened, happened. This sentence is just as true as it is hostile to morals and intellect, right? And he wanted a revolt against reality, a moral turning back of the clock. He says, only I know, right, what I suffered, right? Not Waj, the SS man who beat me every day, and not society, which cares only about its continued existence, right? And he rejects reconciliation. He rejects atonement as having, quote, only theological meaning, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's a powerful moral complaint, but it's also societally, it's a dead end, right? And it's not a and you know, I think a lot about this sort of his discussion of reconciliation, of redemption and atonement as having only theological meaning in that regard, right? Because what do you do with people who have suffered the sorts of things that he did, right? What would, you know, redress even begin to look like, right, in the wake of that kind of horror, right? And that kind of horror multiplied out, you know, by the millions. And yet, of course, you know, the demand for society to stop moving is its own kind of moral horror.
When I was thank you, Phil. When I was a younger teacher, I met a dentist named Dr. Rene Molo of blessed memory, and he was a Holocaust survivor. He's now passed, but he decided he came and shared his story at my class with my classes when I was a young teacher. And the kind of hope-filled, starry-eyed young suburban kids would say, after he presented, you know, he's a dentist, so you imagine what he did, what his job was. He had to extract the gold from teeth and all that stuff of corpses, from corpses. And the kids would ask him, well, have you forgiven the Germans? You know, and I think every time I just would, the spirit was moving in me in my own way, but it was, I said, I am allergic to Germans. You know, and they would just writhe in their chair because it doesn't fit their narrative of, you know, reconciliation. And so Philip Metris is about to lead us on, and Philip Metris lives in these zones in shrapnel maps, which is a beautifully designed book. But before we turn to Philip Metris, can we, Phil Cly, a final word from your reading? Anything moving in you, but I want to thank you for that. Clap my hands. Was there any final thought from you before we come back to Phil?
I'm eager to hear from Phil.
Yeah.
Other Phil.
Yeah.
This is quite
yeah, good.
It was wonderful to have such a Phil-filled conversation.
I know.
Catholic imagination and war.
Yeah, yeah. So everybody, let's just thank Phil Cly for his work. You know, this is I hate to throw the word around, but it's a tour de force, missionaries. And these are two beautiful books, very different, but lots of overwhelming material, but lots of grace and lots of things that join them together. So without further ado, Philip Metris, please take it away.
Thanks, Michael. And thanks, Phil. And thanks as well to the Hank Center and Megan Toomey for setting this up. And thanks to all of you. I know that Zoom is a very difficult medium, but I'm seeing all your faces here. For those of you who have your faces on the camera, you're brave souls. Thank you for taking this time with us and for being present. It's just such a strange medium. But you know, I wanted to start actually with a little anecdote, which was I was teaching this course on the Troubles and the peace in Northern Ireland. Tom, we see your hand, and you'll definitely be part of the process. And one of these students responded after I was teaching them a little bit about nonviolent communication and peacemaking, some general skills to peacemaking. I taught them some of the parts of John Paul Lederach's The Moral Imagination, in which he outlines 4 capacities to the moral imagination: compassion, curiosity, creativity, and courage. And my student responded, you know, I grew up Catholic, she's still Catholic, and I grew up always being asked to pray for peace, but I was given no skills in figuring out how to be a peacemaker or how to build peace in my society. And I thought that is a deeply Catholic predicament that we found ourselves in contrast to the Mennonites or the Quakers. I was just giving a talk at Goshen a couple of days ago how much the historic peace churches centered their thinking on about war in a witness against violence and in a whole practice of peace building and peacemaking. Thankfully, for those of you who haven't read it, Pope Francis's recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti, sort of "We are all brothers and sisters," is a remarkable document, a really groundbreaking document in Catholic thinking, bringing together and holding up the peace tradition within our own church. We've been so dominated by the just war tradition, which has its importance in its own way, of course. But how deeply moved I was to read his call for us to be artisans of peace, to be architects of peace, that each of us has a role to play in our own society, in our lives, and in the world, to do more than simply be a faithful person, but to be someone who's helping to build a world where everyone has dignity. And I'm glad that Phil mentioned that word dignity. So this book, Shrapnel Maps, that was published last year, is kind of a long meditation through poems on the Israeli and Palestinian predicament. And as such, because I am neither Palestinian nor Israeli, I can only speak for my own understanding and my own experience. I can only speak for myself. But what I hope I've done in this book is enabled readers to accompany myself through a process of encounter, listening, engagement, and understanding. So I teach at John Carroll University, a Jesuit college just down the road. And I am situated, I live in a neighborhood that's predominantly modern Jewish Orthodox. The book often toggles between my neighborhood and Israel-Palestine, that place, however we want to call it. And as such, my connection to that place is various. Obviously, our faith traditions connect us, but my sister, I have a deeply personal connection, which is my sister met a Palestinian man after living in the West Bank many years ago, and ended up marrying him. And we went to the wedding, and so he became part of our family. And I got to witness firsthand both the kind of bitterness of military occupation under which Palestinians live in the West Bank, and also the sweetness of village life, of Palestinian village life. And trying to deal with both of those things at the same time brought me back home trying to understand more. I had been educated well, I think, in a variety of ways about the Holocaust and the depredations that Jewish people have experienced over the millennia. So it was very hard for me to understand and to feel compassion for what Palestinians were going through until my sister came back with those stories, and until I saw for myself what was happening. And of course, there's no comparison of suffering, but that predicament, that complexity, that reality that people are dealing with systems that are beyond their control is something that I felt very much part of the experience. So I'd like to share with you some poems. Here's a poem that took place more or less in this fashion at my university. It's called Family. And I think it articulates kind of the dilemma of being a person who wants to understand and wants to do better. So here it is, Family. At the Catholic University, a speaker clicks through slide after slide of barbed wire, cattle chute checkpoints, and walls. His mantra, occupation. What threatens the Christians, he concludes, is what threatens Palestinians. A woman stands up. I wanted to let everyone know, she says, that this talk was full of spin. I can't see her, she's behind me, I'm afraid to look back. The truth is the opposite. My heart goes out to her, standing in the heart of another country. The reason for the wall was that people were being attacked, she says, by terrorists. After all, the Arabs sold the land, it was too much trouble. I shrink back in my seat. And at a Catholic school, you should know what the church has done, especially during World War II. Then a man gets up. I can't see him. He's behind me. I'm afraid to look back. The Jews bought a tiny bit of land, but the rest was stolen. My heart goes out to him, standing in the heart of another country. But, he says, they did not buy everything, even if they buy Congress. I shrink again. She says, you have 14 Arab countries. Can't we have just one? They should take you in. He says, but this is our land. Why should we have to leave? Because Europe took it from us? That is why we fight. What about peace? Someone mumbles. He says, how can you negotiate over a pizza when one side continues to eat? She says, how can you negotiate over a pizza when one side's trying to stab you with knives? It goes on like this for a long time. Years, decades, generations. I sit like a child at the table, watch parents grip utensils, spit words like shrapnel. I hate how I love them. Ashamed, I look down, unable to bury the hot metal. So this is a poem about many things, of course, not only these two narratives in which each person has a truth to tell the audience and each other, and yet in the process of telling their truth, somehow kind of is unable to see the pain and the truth and the reality of the other. And of course, the third person is myself, and I felt this so many times, caught in a situation of frozenness, of inability to know how to proceed. And I wish, of course, when this happened, more or less in this fashion, that I had welcomed each person, who was, in some sense, a stranger in that space, who probably didn't feel at home, who probably felt that they were the only person. And of course, there probably would have been no agreement, but at least we would have been there together and sort of, the frame of this poem is family, because I do feel that we are family, whether we're Jews or Catholics or Muslims. And that doesn't make it any easier, as Phil's character is named, Abel. It's Abel, like even in the Bible, brothers kill brothers. So one of the things I want to do in this book is move past this kind of complexity, or move past this set of frozenness, and also try to elevate some people who've done acts of moral courage, who've stood in solidarity with people. And one of them is an amazing man by the name of Rabbi Arik Osherman. And I'd like to share an image of him so you can see him in action. Just give me 1 second here. That's the book. That's my sister at our wedding. That's me. It's a little bit from that's my neighborhood. This is the reality that woman was articulating. And this is the reality that Palestinian man was articulating. And this is our brave man, Rabbi Arik Osherman. This is based on an interview that he gave. I sort of borrowed, remixed, and made this into a bit of a sonnet. It's called According to this Midrash for Rabbi Arik Osherman. The Midrash says, when Hagar and Ishmael are banished into the desert, before God builds a well, the angels cry, what are you doing? Don't you know the Suris, the Jewish people, are going to suffer at the hands of the children of Ishmael? And God, according to this Midrash, says, right now, in front of me, there's a child. Right now, this child is innocent. Look, I know some Palestinians would want to kill me and my children. I know some Israelis do not see Palestinians as human and use the law to keep us separate. But when I visit Palestinians, they waken their children to meet us in the caves where they live after their house was demolished. We sit on packed suitcases as they serve me tea. Their son, who'd been tied to a windshield by the army, and the man in a kippah who'd come to his aid. And I wanted to show a video as well. Is this visible? Phil and Michael, can you see this? Okay, good, thank you. So in the West Bank during the 2000s, Israel built a separation barrier between itself and Palestinian territories. However, this wall was often built on Palestinian land and divided Palestinian communities from each other, from their own land, and from their olive groves. There were many protests during this period, many of them nonviolent, but also there was, of course, other activities happening, stones thrown and things like that. During this time, Huwaida Araf, an incredibly brave Palestinian American who had started an organization with her husband, Adam Shapiro, which was called the International Solidarity Movement, got involved in standing with Palestinians who are nonviolently protesting. And this is a poem about something that she did, which you're going to see in a minute here, about an incredibly courageous intervention that she made. It's called The Dance of the Activist and the Typist for Huwaida Araf. She inserts the inked ribbon of herself between the black roller of history and the alphabetic metal legs of that inverted insect. Rifles thrash the air, the targets scatter. She can't help it. Something in her grows each time she turns to face the rifle. Grows as she covers its permanent erection. The typist lifts his wrists and legs hover to stamp. Where the rifle moves, she moves. A mirror following the lead of inevitable lead. She's the rifle unfired, shield of flesh, her arms overhead, before the muzzle, as if she could cradle a bullet. I think I have time for one more poem. There's so much to say, there's so much to share, but I don't want to give you too much to chew on. So I think I'm going to end with a poem called Izdud. Izdud was a village that was destroyed in 1948 alongside hundreds of other villages when Palestinians fled or were expelled during the violence that blew up from November of 1947 through the declaration of the State of Israel in 1948 until the armistice. There were 700,000 Palestinians who were made refugees. Many of them not only lost their houses and their country, but they lost any opportunity to ever return. My friend Fadi Judah is a Palestinian American, and his email was Izdud, and I won't tell you the rest, but Izdud at something something. And I said, what is Izdud? I didn't know. And he said, that's the village that my parents were expelled from. And so learning that and learning a little bit more about that history of what happened, the Nakba, as Palestinians call it, in 1947 and 48, gave me a renewed appreciation for the trauma at the heart of the Palestinian story. So this is a poem which celebrates his beautiful poems, his dervish-like poems. By the way, Mahmoud Darwish, the famous Palestinian poet, Darwish is actually the Arabic word for dervish, as you know, spinning. And Fadi is a wonderful translator of Darwish. So the last thing that's referenced in this poem is that there are images you can find online of an old refugee having the opportunity to visit the place he came from, and all that's left there are ruins. So Izdud for Fadi Judah. Dear descendant of the disappeared, you ascend the pillar of your own air, spin and span whole abysses, with lines translating there to here and here to where wind winds in dry wadis, hoists sea in handful after invisible handful. Izdud now, an email address, and digital image of branches through windows within school ruins. A refugee points with his cane to what he only can see. You argue against the argument against yourself, you yourself make and home in. Kiss my blind eyes clear, close keyholes with opening, homeland, you cradle in vowels what was not never yours. I'll hold it here till you return. Thanks, everybody.
That's great.
Wow. Yeah. What do you think, Phil?
That was fantastic. And on the, since you tied the questions of peacemaking and Fratelli Tutti, then to this sort of like sense of historical memory and rootedness. I mean, rootedness is one of the words that I think of when I'm thinking about this book, and one of the reasons is because there's a recurring image of trees, and there's this sometimes tension between sort of a kind of respect for local tradition, local culture, right? A lot of bad things have been justified by people claiming they're trying to preserve their way of life. But then also there's a lot of sort of deeply important things and people trying to be rooted in a place. And one of the points that Francis makes is that a kind of respect for local tradition and local culture and local communities is not at odds with the universal call to of the church. He says, we are more alone than ever in an increasingly massified world that promotes individual interests and weakens the communitarian dimensions of life. And he, in a way, the sort of the way to promote peacemaking is not through simply sort of broad, impersonal solutions, so they must be a part of it. But also, he says peace is not achieved by normative frameworks and institutional arrangements between well-meaning political or economic groups. It is always helpful to incorporate into our peace processes the experience of those sectors that have often been overlooked so that communities themselves can influence the development of a collective memory. And so there's that sense of building up and strengthening local groups, associations, through which people on the ground can both express themselves and their culture and have some degree of power. And there's a moment in the book where, this is from one of the poems, he passed an olive tree necklace to you saying, a country is more important than one person. You'd carry its quandary 10 years around your wandering. And now this country draws you the way olive roots welcome far water. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about not just that sort of tension between the local and the universal, but also the tension between multiple local traditions and cultures, because of course part of the problem here is there are multiple communities with roots in the same soil.
Thanks, Phil. It's wonderfully put. I mean, one answer to this conundrum, or one place to look, is that at how communities there and how people, not only like Rabbi Eric Osherman, who are engaging in sort of, I don't know, quite spectacular acts of courage, but also local groups. That there's a sort of settler community that had some particularly visionary members and began to be in relationship in a sort of proactive relationship with their Palestinian neighbors in ways that were very intentional and about trying to overcome what they recognized was a situation of not only deep division, but of an unhealthy sort of relationship. And so that's one place that we can look on the ground, as Pope Francis says, to communities that are doing that work. There's always a tension between the local and the universal, or the local and the national, and this is not only our own tradition. I mean, it's so interesting, right? Catholicism is not really a tradition anchored in roots, in place, the way that Judaism is. I mean, just as an observation, right? That there was an attempt sort of early on to make it a universal faith. So, I can't speak in any, I don't know, nuance to this question of, within Judaism, the questions about whether or not one's faith is, are we appealing to sort of like a local or universal sensibility of how we are to be in the world? All those questions are certainly around the questions of the state of Israel, of course. What does it mean to, to have a religious state in this way? Yeah, I mean, Palestinians would say that, we belong. We're part of the soil. We've been here for hundreds, thousands of years, and Israelis would say, but we've returned. We've had a long time away, and we've returned. Palestinians would say, no, that's this is just a kind of colonialism, and Israelis and Jews would say that's unfair. That doesn't articulate our reality, and we'll go around that carousel, and I can't answer, or it's not my job to say what the reality is. All that I can see is two peoples whose histories and narratives have told them that the world is against them, and that their situation of precarity needs to be responded to with not only perseverance but strength, and that's a really difficult situation. But it's not unique in the world. This exact same dynamic has been in there in Northern Ireland. In some ways, it was there in South Africa and elsewhere. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but
yeah. And so then, what is the what is the responsibility for the poet then?
Yeah.
And
that's a question I can answer.
Yeah.
Well, I felt like it wasn't my job to write a book of advocacy or social justice, although I'm sure some people might read it that way. I think that the book is trying to illuminate the ways in which there are serious power differentials, between, the parties involved. But I thought my job was to abide with, and to try as best I could to encounter the voices that I researched and talked with and imagined, in ways that might help us all come to not simply a complicated understanding, but an actionable one, I guess. And so to move from a set of frozenness and a set of shame about what our church has done and what, all of the injustices of, our own tradition relative to this situation, but also to play a role of recognition for what has happened. And with recognition then comes repentance. And after repentance comes reparation, and maybe after that, maybe something like reconciliation. So I wanted to play a role that was one of accompaniment, encounter, and an attempt to understand and invite others into that understanding.
That's brilliant and edifying and inspiring. I don't want to be fatuous here, Philip, at all. What you do as a poet is the one of these great phrases that you said with the rabbi poem. You cradle the reality in vowels. There's a lovingness there. Levertov herself talked about poetry as an abode of mercy. I don't know if that can work that way. And mercy is a very problematic term, for, as you pointed out, Phil. But you know, on the point, because when you're,
I'm pro mercy. I just want to be clear.
I know you are. Yeah. Yeah.
On the record, pro mercy.
Pro mercy. Clyde,
I think it should be registered that there are folks who are not, right.
You're right. You're right.
and not in a flippant way, you know.
No, you're right. And I have you down as pro mercy, and as difficult as that is for all of us to do. Philip Metris, you're indicating.
But by the way, I think that's really important, actually, and it's interesting because I was thinking about this in terms of, you know, what I was talking about earlier, this kind of small c conservative way that the artist kind of approaches the world, which is trying to describe it, right? But then there's also this sort of way of, you know, you're approaching the world, and I'm thinking about something, Philip, like the section, I think it's called Theater of Operations, where you have all of these different sort of poems from different voices around, you know, a bombing, and there's a way in which there's great care to the individual perspectives, right, and the individual sort of political certainties, you know, of the characters, you know, the man who wants, you know, simply have known a child who will laugh without fear, but why am I still afraid of this Arab here, right? My tongue wrestles with new words, so why do I taste metal like blood in the mouth? Why do I feel so alive this close to death? But then there's also something in the arrangement and the way in which you're guiding us through these experiences that I think the intention certainly seems to me to be in that other way, that more revolutionary role that art can play, in which through the guiding of an individual through these experiences, not as I'm intending you to evaluate these as political arguments, but rather as kind of effective experiences I'm trying to immerse you in, that might change one's perspective, or sort of open up new possibilities around the situation.
Yeah, there's something of a Dante move there. You have any thought on that, Phil Metris?
I'm grateful for your careful and close reading, and I think that's right. You know, I mean, yeah, and the hazard of writing a book like this is, of course, it upsets everyone because it's upsetting. All of it is upsetting.
Right.
All of it is upsetting. But that was just, I felt after all these years that I had something that I needed to say about it, and may I be forgiven for all the ways in which I failed to understand, you know, people's realities.
You know,
we're pro mercy over here.
We're pro mercy. We've established the fact that we're
lucky for you.
Yeah, we don't. Our memory is short. Our forgiveness is long. Hey, Phil Metris. You know, also another concept I think you are fond of, and that you practice so beautifully, is the idea of palimpsest, right? So, and that's the kind of cartography part of your work. Your work is so innovative. There's so many forms happening here. And then you're mixing in kind of tourism posters. You're evoking a sense of place. You're evoking complexity. But I just wanted to say that there's something I think very Catholic. If there's not a sense of place with being a Catholic, there is something about moments about incarnational understanding. So, and that's a place, you know. And so the Catholic imagination wants to get small and fond and local, as Mary Carr might say. But then it wants to be cosmopolitan as well. And I think you do that in your work. You know, you take Jaffa and Tel Aviv, and you see the layers there. So I think that's an expert sequence toward the end of the book there. Any thought about that?
From your lips to God's ears. Thank you. I mean, no, I mean, I do. I wanted to write a book that was an immersive experience, that was both, you know, poems and images and, you know, documents, and because going back to this thing that I asked Phil about, because I think that if our conversation remains on the level of the individual, the sacred human, the one who has dignity, that's important, but there are all these systems we have to contend with in which we find ourselves, and that's why some of those other layers, I hope, provide a dimensionality that that opens us to what these large operations of states and of powers do to peoples.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, you've done it. Now we're getting toward the end of our time. I have a little special kind of tableau I want to show you. I want you to know that there haven't been that many questions. And I think it's because that the conversation and the work has been so rich. There's been a couple from Ed Hart and things like, do you think that the emphasis on military solutions to conflict has blinded our imagining other ways of conflict resolution, things like that? I'd like you to hold that thought, because I think what I'm going to show you, it's about a 4-minute clip, 4.5-minute clip from the film Atonement, directed by Joe Wright. This is meant to be kind of a part of our liturgy. So I'll ask folks to stay on until 5:33 because I want Phil to close. But as you watch this short clip, it's one shoot, it's one take, it's a long take, 5 minutes. It is one of the best bits of film I think I can think of, people. This is cinematic history here. Just the background, we have James McAvoy's character trying to get home to his love, and there's some conflict there as well. This is the evacuation of Dunkirk in 1940. The movie came out in 2005, I think. The novel, late 90s, I believe, if memory serves, by Ian McEwan. One thing you have to know is that McAvoy's character has a bullet in his gut, and no one knows it except for him. And I think the rest speaks for itself. It's a living tableau of what Phil Metris wrote for our description disc. How violence, warfare, and oppression are mediated through an imagination that knows the profound failure of such human endeavors. So please, without further ado, it's about 4.5 minutes. I'm going to share my screen and turn up your volume. Joe Wright, Atonement, 2005, I think. And here we go.
Just arrived, sir. Can you tell us what we're supposed to be doing?
Nothing, just wait.
Where are the ships?
A few men in yesterday, Luftwaffe blew them to buggery. Lost 3,000 men when they sank Lancaster. High Command, in his infinite wisdom, is denying us air cover. Disgrace. Fucking disaster.
Look, the thing is, you see, I'm expecting back, you see.
There's over 300,000 men on this beach, Private. You have to wait your turn. It'd be great if you're not wounded. I'd orders to leave the wounded behind.
No, leave it, Gov. Never trust a sailor on dry land. You're best off out of it.
That's not right.
Set it up. all grey, can you see?
Well, that's the music in there is James Greenleaf Whittier, the Quaker, from Dear Lord, excuse me.
After finishing the last Bond movie, I wanted to try and find something that I've never.
Sorry about that. That's the that is the teacher's foe. Anyway, to conclude, sorry about that. It's James Greenleaf Whittier's piece, Dear Lord, Father of Mankind, very male, obviously, and the ironies are manifold. The beauty of thy peace in the middle of that carnival-like carnage. But what just to wrap, any final thoughts just on everything we've been through today? And Phil Cly, you first, please.
This has been really lovely. It's funny thinking of that quick clip. I'm thinking about a bit from Ford Maddox Ford's Parade's End, where one character says, "Beastly war, this beastly war," and the main character, it's an encouraging sight. As he's looking at it, soldiers going off to the front. He says, the beastliness of human nature is always pretty normal. We lie and cheat and steal in war as well as in peace. But here you've got, hundreds of thousands of men marching towards some place that they don't want to go. They desperately don't want to go, and they're going. And of course, it's towards a senseless slaughter in that book. But I think there's something sort of profoundly powerful and human that you can see in war, and tremendously inspiring as well. But that all too often is harnessed in the worst of all possible ways. And I think that it's a messy, complicated subject, but I'm certainly glad there are folks like Philip trying to think and imagine their way through it.
I think you're right to include that, Phil Clyde, because it's the truth. It's it is the center of anthropology to realize that we navigate opposites. I think Chris Hedges' book, 2002, that war is a force that gives, that provides meaning. I think he's after that in his classical reading. But Philip Metris, the last word is yours, my friend. So what are your observations as we kind of conclude today?
I'm grateful to have been engaging in conversation with each of you, and I wish that we could speak with everyone who's been listening. Obviously, you can contact me anytime, via my email address, which is at the John Carroll website, of course. My hope is that as we develop our capacities for peacemaking and that we develop as vivacious and as vigorous and as courageous a tradition in that area as we do and have in our warrior context, in the context of war. I mean, I think that's where my hope is that we can grow as people, as Catholics, and maybe as a species, to find ways to find the moral equivalent of war, as William James once called it, where men see men see ways, and women of course as well, but people see ways that they can be fully themselves and the agents of their own destiny, not through violence, but through mercy, kindness, generosity, and love.
Thank you. I think we had a couple late observations come in, so I'll let you know. I will happily have a couple of women who responded. Really grateful to notice again, this is Dr. Naomi Fisher, that art doesn't provide false reductions. And I think we're hearing that, and that's wonderful. A student, Mona Tariq, is always noticing this statement: all art and media are political. I think you're right, Mona. We can't escape it. So with that, and with, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Megan and Kathleen for getting us organized. I want to thank Phil Cly and congratulate you on your wonderful book. And Philip Metris, I want to congratulate you on your wonderful book. And I want to thank you for stopping by the Hank Center. And peace be with everybody. And may you find mercy in your life. Amen.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.